Welcome to the Hometime Project Center. I'm Dean Johnson.
And I'm JoAnne Liebeler. In the video you're about to see, Dean and I will be showing you what's involved in building a deck for the outside of your house. We'll start with the fundamentals, showing you basic steps and techniques as we construct a small deck in our studio.
Then we'll apply these principles to a second-story deck for an existing house. In the process, you'll learn about the tools and materials that can make the construction stronger, easier, and faster.
Hometime is made possible by Chevy Truck, who brings you tough, full-size Chevy pickups for professionals and do-it-yourselfers like you. Chevy S10 pickups, compact, fun, and hard-working. Chevy S10 Blazer, logic and laughter in 2- or 4-wheel drive. Chevy Astro, the van that can. The heartbeat of America. Today's Chevy Truck.
This video is just one in a library of instructional programs designed to assist the viewer in working on a wide range of home improvement projects. And before we begin our program, I want to explain how you can best make use of this educational system. First off, you should watch the tape all the way through to get an idea of the methods, the steps, and the terminology we use. To help familiarize yourself with the terms, we've included a glossary in the project guide. Then you should review the tape again, only this time, check with your project guide to determine the tools and materials appropriate to your project. Then take the project guide to your local building supply dealer or home center. The people there will be able to assist you, answer questions, and direct you to what you need.
The basic steps in deck construction are planning and design, attaching the ledger board, establishing footings, mounting and cutting the posts, installing the beam, installing the joists, installing the decking, and installing the railing and stairs. You'll find these steps listed in the tape reference chart of your project guide, and it's also a good idea to mark down the counter numbers on your tape player at the beginning of each step to help you review.
One way we'll help you build your deck is to familiarize you with the tools used in deck construction. These tools are standard to many do-it-yourself workshops. A framing square, a combination square, a 4-foot level, a 25-foot and 50-foot tape measure, a building line, a plumb bob, a chalk line, a caulking gun, a hammer, a hand saw, a 7 1/4 inch circular saw, a power miter saw, a socket wrench, an electric drill, a nail set, a bevel, a pry bar, a shovel, a post hole digger, and a wheelbarrow. If you've got a big job, you might consider investing in a pneumatic nailer. Additional tools and equipment you might need include tool belts, safety glasses, extension ladders, and step ladders. We'll be explaining the tools and their application in more detail as we work with them during the program.
The most important tool in building a deck is you. Please be safety conscious. We recommend that you work at a comfortable pace, wear the proper clothing and protection, and follow the manufacturer's guidelines in using their tools, equipment, and materials.
The first and most important stage in any construction project is planning. There are several factors that go in designing a deck. You should first start by looking at several decks. You can also get a lot of ideas and design plans from books and magazines.
Between the two decks that we'll be constructing, you'll see most of the situations that might come up in building any deck. But no matter what size, shape, or type of deck it is, you'll find there are certain elements that are common to all of them.
The boards that make up the flooring of a deck are called the decking. In addition, most decks also have a railing, and many have stairs. Underneath, the structure is made up of joists, which are the pieces that support the decking. At one end, the joists attach to the ledger board, which is attached to the house. At the other end, the joists rest on the beam. The beam rests on vertical timbers called posts, and the posts are set on top of concrete pier blocks.
In your project guide, there are some charts and diagrams that can help you estimate your lumber needs. The size of your deck wood will determine the joist spacing. For our demonstration deck, the deck boards are going to be 2x6s. We could space our joists 24 inches apart, but we'll be conservative and put them on 16-inch centers. The joist spacing and joist size will determine the allowable span for the joists. For 2x8 joists on 16-inch centers, we could span as far as 12 feet 10 inches. Our 6-foot span is well within that. The joist span and the beam span determine the size of the beams. Our joist span of 6 feet and our beam span of 8 feet indicate a 4 by 8 beam. We'll use a 4 by 8 beam made up of two 2 by 8s. The load area is the joist span multiplied by the beam span. We use that and the deck height to determine the size of the posts. Our beam span is 8 feet and our joist span is 6 feet, so our load area is 48 square feet. This means that with a 4 by 4 post, we could go as high as 6 feet. It's a good idea to be a little conservative in calculating your spans and lumber needs. Using thicker boards and shorter spans can help make a deck feel safe and solid without any springiness. Also, you'll probably need a permit to build your deck, so be sure to double check all your deck plans, lumber sizes, and spans to make sure they meet local codes. Your lumber yard should be able to help you with that.
You'll find a materials list in your project guide. Use this in the plan to determine your materials needs. Be sure to allow an extra 10% for waste. Fill out the project guide and take it to your lumber yard.
Pressure-treated lumber is a very popular wood for decks. Pressure-treated means the wood has undergone a process that forces preservatives deep into the wood fibers. Depending on the manufacturer, it could be guaranteed against decay for as long as 30 years. This wood usually has a greenish tint, but it will eventually weather to a silver gray. You can leave the wood this color or finish it with stain or paint. The pressure-treated lumber available at your local yard will probably be Douglas fir or some type of pine.
You might also consider using redwood or cedar. They're attractive woods and they naturally resist decay. However, they're not usually as strong as pressure-treated lumber and they're a little more expensive, so you'll probably want to save them for the exposed areas. You also might think about using a clear finish on these woods.
For the deck we'll be building in our studio, we'll be using pressure-treated lumber for the whole structure. For the deck we're building outside, we'll use redwood for the deck surface, the railings, and the stairs.
There you go. It's important to realize that lumber has both a nominal and an actual dimension, and these aren't always the same. I'll use this 2 by 6 to illustrate the point. Its nominal dimension is 2 inches thick and 6 inches wide, but it actually measures 1.5 inches by 5.5 inches. The reason it's called a 2 by 6 is because in its rough cut state, when the board is first cut from the log, it actually is 2 by 6. Then it's surfaced for smoothness and uniformity, and it becomes 1.5 inches by 5.5 inches. Whether it's a 2 by 6, a 2 by 8, or whatever, remember this when making your materials estimate. These are their nominal dimensions, and they actually measure somewhat less.
Let's get the posts.
All right? The right planning and the right tools make any home project go easier. And so does a new full-size Chevy pickup, like the ones we've got here. A long wheelbase 2-wheel drive model, and an extended cab with 4-wheel drive.
These trucks look good, don't they? And they're tough. Base coat clear coat paint is used for a brilliant finish and is part of 7 layers of corrosion protection in critical areas. And underneath the aerodynamic styling is one of the heaviest frames ever made for a full-size Chevy pickup.
Both of these big Chevys come with an 8-foot cargo box, so they can carry 4 by 8 sheets flat on the floor with the tailgate closed. Plus, you can insert supports here in the box sides for double-deck loading.
The regular full-size Chevy cab has plenty of room for 3 people. If you want even more room, this extended cab model is the way to go. With available seating, there's all kinds of space in here for up to 6 people. You can also fold the available rear seat down or up for additional lockable storage space in back.
This model also has 4-wheel drive, so InstaTrack is standard. InstaTrack lets you shift from freewheeling 2-wheel drive to 4-wheel drive high and back again at any speed. You don't have to slow down, stop, or back up. InstaTrack lets you stay in this comfortable cab and shift on the fly.
You'll shift with hard-working, fuel-injected power, too. These big Chevys come with a 160 horsepower, 4.3-liter Vortec V6. Depending on the model, you can also get available V8s with up to 230 horsepower.
On wet or icy roads, you'll like the standard rear-wheel anti-lock brake system, or ABS for short. It's designed to give smooth, stable stops. On a four-wheel drive model, ABS operates only when the truck's in two-wheel drive.
Treat yourself to a test drive of a new full-size Chevy pickup. Two- or four-wheel drive, regular or extended cab.
You'll see why today's Chevy truck is the heartbeat of America.
We've set up an exterior wall to illustrate the fundamentals of deck construction. We're going to build a simple deck right onto the side of it. Since we're going to attach the deck to the structure, our first step is to remove this lap siding to provide a flat surface for the ledger board.
In establishing the height of the ledger board, we'll need to take into consideration the thickness of the decking and the height of the finished floor of the house. If you're adding an exterior door for access onto the deck from the inside, the height of the deck should be the same as the floor inside. If, as on our wall, there already is an exterior door, the top of the decking should be even with the bottom of the threshold, so that the threshold's overhang rests on the top of the decking. We measure down 1.5 inches for the thickness of the 2x6 deck boards. You mark that at each end of the threshold and check the 2 points for level. Then snap a level chalk line and cut the siding with a circular saw. Before making the cut, I adjusted the saw blade to the depth of the siding. This way I won't cut into the sheathing. This exposes the sheathing. Underneath this will be the house's rim joist. This supports the flooring and walls of the house and is usually a 2x8 or a 2x10. The ledger board will get attached to this to tie the deck to the structure of the house.
Our deck is going to be 10 feet wide, so the ledger board will be 10 feet long. But we'll subtract 1.5 inches at each end for the width of the 2x8 side joists. That makes it 9 feet 9 inches. Before attaching the ledger board to the wall, we're marking the position of the joist hangers, which will support the joists. It's a lot easier to do this on sawhorses than after the ledger is up. The joists will run parallel to each other, and they'll be attached to the ledger board 16 inches on center. In measuring, we marked off 16-inch intervals on the ledger. We used the framing square, which is the same width as the 2x8 joist, to make marks for both sides of the joist.
To keep moisture from seeping into the joint between the ledger board and the house and causing decay, we're installing metal flashing. This is a Z-shaped piece of galvanized sheet metal that fits around the ledger board. We had it formed for us by a sheet metal shop. Then we made a notch in it to fit around the threshold. After we nailed it in place, we ran a bead of silicone caulk between the siding and the flashing. Now we temporarily nail the ledger board onto the side of the structure, positioning it carefully. Then we permanently join the ledger board to the house's rim joist with heavy-duty 3/8-inch lag screws. We pre-drill holes for these bolts with a 5/16-inch bit before we screw them in. And we use screws that are long enough to penetrate through the sheathing and well into the joists.
The bolts are placed in twos and spaced about 1.5 feet apart along the board. If it's possible for you to get inside the structure under the floor, then you may prefer using carriage bolts, which are secured with nuts.
Now we're ready to mount our joist hangers. We use a scrap piece of 2x8 to determine the vertical position of the hangers. The nails are special joist hanger nails. They're thick enough to fit snugly in the hole in the hanger.
Now that the ledger board and the joist hangers are up, we can provide footings for the deck posts. These concrete supports are called piers. Since we're working on a level studio floor, this task is a piece of cake. But later on in the program, we'll show you what this involves in an outdoor setting. Our deck will extend 8 feet out from the side of the house, but the supports don't have to be all the way out at the corners. If we set the piers in from the edges, we get a nice cantilevered effect where the deck seems to float. The rule of thumb is that the overhang can be half the span. We're placing the piers 6 feet from the house, which means we could cantilever the deck up to 3 feet out past the supports. Our 2-foot overhang is well within the allowance. We're also setting the piers 1 foot in from the sides. To locate the pier positions, we first measured out 6 feet from the house and strung up a building line parallel to the house. Now we measure in 1 foot along the side of the house from where each end of the deck will be and attached a piece of building line. To establish a square 90-degree angle, we used the 3, 4, 5 method. With Dean at the free end, I measured 3 feet along the structure and made a mark. Next, I measured along the string 4 feet and made another mark. Then I measured from the 3-foot mark to the 4-foot mark, with Dean able to adjust the position of the string.
We want to make sure that you don't change the tension on the line once you mark it. That could stretch it and change your 4-foot dimension.
Once the distance between the two was exactly 5 feet, it meant we had a square 90-degree angle. Where the two lines cross, we drop a plumb line and mark the spot. Once we had done the same on the other side, we set the piers and cross-checked the distance between them.
We're mounting this metal bracket, called a post anchor, to the top of each pier block. I used a masonry bit to drill a hole in the top of the block. Then we screw them down with masonry screws. Another way to attach the post to the top of the pier block is to pour your own pier blocks and embed the post bracket in the top of the wet concrete. However you do it, make sure that the top of the footing or pier is at least 6 inches above the ground to keep water from settling at the base of the post.
The posts will support the beam. Now for this deck, the beam will consist of 2 2x8s bolted to either side of the post. The joist will hang on the ledger board and rest on top of the beam. So the top of the post will be the same height as the bottom of the ledger. With posts this short, we plumb them and nail them into brackets. With taller posts, we might have to brace them in place. Then we hang a 2x4 in a joist hanger at one end and set a level on top of it. Although the joist will actually be a 2x8, the bottom is all we need to worry about now. The mark gives us the height of the post.
Our beams are made up of 2 2x8s. These run the full 10-foot length of the deck. By calculating where the post should line up and marking the spot on the beams, we can position them accurately and ensure that the posts are plumb. The nailing is just a temporary support while we install the bolts. We drill through the assembly with a long 1/2-inch drill bit. Insert 2 7-inch carriage bolts and tighten. Once the beam is secure, it becomes an easy matter to use a handsaw to cut the top of the post off flush with the top of the beam.
Having secured the beam, we then mark for the placement of the joists, 16 inches on center to align with the joist hangers. The next step is to cut the deck joists to length and install them. Before attaching them, we need to determine the high point or crown of each joist. This is done by sighting down the edge and looking for which way it bows.
Okay, right here.
You want to place them crown up. Over time, the weight of the deck will sag and straighten the bow out.
The outside joists go on first. We start with the side joists and measure where they should fall on the beam. Then we end nail them into the butt end of the ledger board and toe nail them into the beam on our marks. We use 16-penny double-dip galvanized nails for all our nailing. Then we nail the rim joists into the ends of the side joists.
Good, okay.
Once we mark the 16-inch centers on the rim joists, we're ready to put in the interior joists. First, we hang them on the ledger board. We're careful to butt them tight into the hangers. This way, the far edge of the deck will be straight. A toenail into the ledger board through the top of the joist helps us. Then we end nail each joist into the rim joist on our marks. And finally, toenail it into the beam. This gives us a chance to straighten out any bends by forcing the joist onto the marks on the beam.
Once all the joists were in, we installed a 2x8 spacer between the last two joists on each side. This ensures the outside joists are absolutely straight. This illustrates the basic elements that make up the substructure. Now, there are variations on how you design this part of your deck. This type of construction will allow you to make the deck lower to the ground. Instead of resting the joists on top of the beams, you eliminate the beam by doubling up the outside joists and running the post up into the corner. Use carriage bolts to secure it into the rim joist. Then you use joist hangers on the inside of the rim joist, hanging the interior joists at both ends. When you build the frame this way, you want to make sure to double up on all the perimeter joists. You might also want another post in the center of the span for additional support. And another thing, the post has to be right at the corner of the deck, which means no cantilever. We'll see a third type of post beam joint when we construct our outside deck. But now, we're ready to put the decking on this one.
To install the 2x6 deck boards, we begin at the house side and start nailing.
With a 10-foot long deck, we'd normally use 10-foot lengths of wood. However, we're intentionally using shorter boards than we could to show you what happens when you need to join boards together. For proper stability, the end of every board must land on a joist. It's also very important to stagger our joints. Joints that fall along the same joist will weaken the integrity of the deck. When nailing the decking, we also want to space the boards. Placing a 16-penny nail in the gap is a popular form of spacing, and it's enough to allow for drainage.
We're placing each board bark side up, so that the circles in the grain at the end arc up like a sunrise. If the board warps, it will cup downward. By placing the boards this way, we ensure that the water will roll off them. We're driving 2 nails into every joist. We hammer the nail heads flush into the surface of the wood. If you're worried about missing and putting dimples into the deck surface, you can use a nail set for the last few strokes.
Here at the splice, we pre-drill holes for the nails. Another trick to avoid splitting the wood near the end is to blunt the nail tip before nailing it in.
You're bound to run into some boards that aren't perfectly straight. Depending on how bowed the board is, you can use a pry bar to straighten these out as you nail. First, start a nail, angling it in the direction you want the board to move. Then hammer the pry bar into the joist outside the board. Use the bar to lever the board into position and finish the nailing. For a deck this size, it won't take us long to nail down all the deck boards. But if you're working on a larger deck, you might consider using a pneumatic nailer. You'll need to get a compressor, a hose, and the nailer itself. There you go.
Thanks.
Be sure to use galvanized nails.
Although the tool does have a safety guard to keep it from discharging unless it's up against a piece of wood, you should always disconnect it from the compressor when loading, servicing, or adjusting it. Plug it back in only when you're ready to use it. Make sure the compressor is set to the proper pressure for your particular tool. Wear eye protection when nailing, and keep your hands away from the nailing area. We're laying our deck boards parallel. However, there are a number of different patterns that you can use: herringbone, diagonal, or parquet. Or you can alter the width of the boards to form another kind of pattern. If you're laying your boards parallel, check every so often to make sure you're going to come out parallel at the far side. If you need to, you can make small adjustments in the spacing to get yourself back on track.
Now that all the deck boards are installed, we can remove the excess from the ends. To get an accurate cut, we snap a chalk line to guide the saw. This edge can overhang or be cut flush to the outer joists, as we're doing here. I set the depth of the saw blade to the thickness of the deck boards so that I don't cut into the underlying joists.
The next step is to add the railing to the deck. There are unlimited styles you can choose. We're going with a common style made up of 2x2 verticals, or balusters, 2x4 side rails, and 2x6 cap rails. I'll be cutting these 2x2 balusters to the proper height with a power miter saw. Now this is a great all-purpose cutting tool that makes fast and accurate cuts. It can be set to cut at any angle from 0 to 45 degrees. Right now, I want a square cut. I loosen and pivot the handle to the 0-degree stop on the table gauge. Tighten, line the blade up with the mark, and cut. As with other power saws, you need to treat the power miter with a great deal of respect. When you operate a power miter saw, be sure to wear safety glasses and keep all fingers and clothing away from the cutting blade. We also recommend that you check the guard before you turn on the saw to see that it operates smoothly.
We cut the balusters to reach from the bottom of the joist to 38.5 inches above the deck. The cap rails will bring the railing up to a 40-inch height. We put in the outside balusters on each side first and nail a straight 2x6 across the tops. Now we line the other balusters up and make them snug against the 2x6 at the top. Then we secure them with a power nailer. Our balusters are spaced 7 inches on center. This leaves a gap between them of 5.5 inches. This gap is often regulated by building codes, so check what's required in your area. We're making the gaps on this side a little less than 5.5 inches. This keeps us from having one gap at the end a little smaller than the rest. The next component is the side rail. This is a 2x4 that is attached along the sides of the balusters, flush at the top, and serves to tie them all together. We're attaching the side rail to the inside of the balusters, but sometimes the design will work better by attaching it on the outside.
Following the side rail, we add the cap rail. This board protects the end grain of the balusters and gives the railing a clean, finished appearance. To attach it, we're nailing into the side rail every 6 inches or so. Here where the handrails meet at the corner, we cut a 45-degree miter joint with the miter saw.
That's one simple way of putting up a railing. On this side, we've changed our style a little bit. Some decorative elements are now available in pressure-treated lumber. Here we've used pre-made balusters and handrails and a lattice to dress around the base. Check with your local lumber yards to see what's available in your area.
We've also added a set of stairs leading down from the deck. Later on, we'll be coming back to the studio to detail stair construction. But now, let's take a look at the site for our big outside deck and get started on that project.
We're going to be building a new deck on the back of this house that can be accessed through the doors from the master bedroom, from the sunken living room, and from the family room. The ledger board's already up, and you can already begin to see that the finished deck's going to be unusual in a couple of ways.
In planning the deck, we knew we wanted it spacious enough for barbecuing and for socializing. And we also wanted to provide stair access to the backyard and to provide a view of the lake. In your planning and preparation stage, it's always a good idea to check out other decks in the area for some ideas, and that's just what we did.
We looked at some pretty nice decks. In addition to having a terrific lake view, this one had a special cutout to accommodate a tree. We saw an example of a combination railing and bench, and a variation on that where the supporting post came up through the deck floor to become part of the rail. This deck also had a few extras you might want to consider, from a custom shelf for a flower arrangement to a hot tub with a view of the lake.
Now this deck really appealed to us. The cantilevered effect is enhanced by hiding the supports behind boulders. It has an interesting outline, and the deck boards run diagonally away from the house. And it has a grand stairway that incorporates a bench at the bottom. Armed with these ideas, we went to work planning our deck.
A landscape architect helped us work through a couple versions of our deck. We started with a fairly standard deck that extends a little beyond the family room and has a stairway, called folding stairs, along the side. One problem we found in this design is that it cut off all the light to the rooms on the lower level. So we made a modification and opened up an area between the deck and the family room to bring in more light underneath. We also shifted the stairs around, but in making these changes, we decreased the size of the deck.
So then we temporarily removed the stairs and opened up the light well more and added another light well. We still had access to the various upstairs rooms, and we increased the amount of light to the downstairs den. Now all we needed were the stairs. To fix this, we extended the angle of the deck to incorporate the stairway. Then, to fill this void, we added a tree. Another detail we added to the design was the direction of the deck boards. Running them diagonally adds an interesting effect to the overall shape.
The deck will have 5 beams, 3 for the deck and 2 for the staircase. The joists will sit on top of the outside beam for the cantilevered section, but the other beams are at the same height as the joists, so we'll use joist hangers to make these connections. And because the weight of the cantilever will tend to pull the ends of the joists up, we'll turn the joist hangers upside down to hold the joists down.
Building a deck of this size and complexity will take more than a weekend to put up, and it will also require the help of a few friends. Now, our plans call for 3 ledgers. The ledgers are 2x10 pressure-treated lumber that have been mounted into the house's rim joists with lag screws. And once these ledgers are in place, you can mark out the post footings.
There are 11 footings for our deck. To locate their exact positions, we string up building line and make our measurements off of that. We use stakes to hold the line in place. When we get to the outside corner of the stairs, we use the 3-4-5 method to make a right angle. We find the spot for each footing, then drop a plumb line and mark the center of each hole.
Now we pull the stakes and mark a 12-inch box to guide us in digging the footings. Footings are basically holes filled with concrete. They provide support for the posts and distribute the load of the structure. The top part of the footing is the pier. The diameter of the footing is also critical. Typically, the diameter of the footing is twice the width of the pier. Since the base of our piers will be 6 inches square, the diameter of the holes will be 12 inches. A post hole digger makes the job easier, but it's still a lot of work. If your deck requires a lot of digging, you may want to rent a power auger. In planning your deck and digging your footings, you want to make sure to avoid any power, waste, water, gas, or underground sprinkler lines. The minimum depth for a footing comes under the jurisdiction of local building codes. Here in the northern part of the country, our footings have to extend below the frost line to a depth of 42 inches.
With the holes dug and examined by the building inspector, we can then make our pour. We took down our building lines to dig the footings and pour the concrete. When we finish our pour, we'll put them back up so that we can place the pier blocks in their exact locations. We use sacks of pre-mixed concrete. It's taking about 10 sacks per hole, so that means a lot of mixing and pouring. Now we leave them to cure overnight. Now that the footings have cured, we're ready to place our pier blocks. The posts will be attached to these using these metal post anchors. I drill the holes with a 1/4-inch masonry bit. Then I mount the anchor with exterior construction cement and these special masonry screws.
Now for the posts. For our deck, we're using 8-foot lengths of 6x6 pressure-treated lumber. We'll mark them, cut them, and brace them in place. I use a 2x4 and a level to transfer the height of the bottom of the ledger board out onto the post.
Okay.
I hold the post plumb while JoAnne figures out how tall it needs to be.
Okay.
The beam that rests on this post is at the same height as the ledger board, so this mark is where we should cut off the post.
The 6x6 will take 4 cuts, 1 on each side, since the saw blade isn't big enough to get through it in one pass. We finish it off with a handsaw.
We plumb this first post and nail it into the anchor.
Okay.
Then we plumb it again and brace it with these temporary supports.
Okay, JoAnne, you can get it up there. I pretty well got it.
Now we use this post to find the height of the next 2 posts out from the house.
Okay.
Our last beam is lower than the first 2, so we make sure to cut it off at the proper height.
We'll use the same technique to install the rest of the posts. It's important to brace the posts not only to the ground, but to each other. This way we'll have a solid base to set our beams on. Right there?
We'll install the beams in this order. First, the 2 long ones that run parallel to the house. Then the diagonal beam that runs between them. Then this outside beam. We'll leave the staircase beams for later. Since we have so many joist hangers, we're going to set them on first before we put the beams in place.
The longest beam goes in first. We nailed 2 2x10s together to make this beam, so it's pretty heavy. We set it first in the special double-width joist hanger that we mounted on the ledger board. Then we rest it on the posts and toenail it with 16-penny galvanized nails.
Because this was such a long beam, we had to splice shorter pieces together. Note that the splices land on top of the posts and that the 2 sides are spliced over different posts. Next, we cut the second beam to length and put it in place. It's secured to the ledger with a metal corner brace and it's toe-nailed in from the other side. We cut the end of the diagonal beam to 45 degrees. It fits in this special double-width angled joist hanger and rests on a post at the other end. We leave the outside beam long when we install it. We'll cut it to length when we install the rim joists.
Now for the joists. First we put in the joists that run between the house and the first beam. We cut the joists to length before we install them. We had a slight problem with our first few joist hangers. Because of the door threshold, we weren't able to slide the joists into both joist hangers at the same time. So we set each joist into the first hanger and then put the other hanger up after the joist is in place. The joists that butt up against the angled side of the house will get toe-nailed into the ledger. Then we put a 2x2 joist support underneath.
Next come the joists that will go between the first and second beams. At this end, we have angled hangers for joists that tie into the diagonal beam. The rest just drop into the two sets of joist hangers.
Over here a little bit.
Ready? Up
Right in.
and down.
Perfect. Okay. Then we put in the rim joist.
That looks good. Go ahead.
Right there?
Yep.
Okay. Once the first one is in, we square the second one off of it to mark the angled end of the outside beam.
Go ahead.
Okay. Cutting this beam takes 2 cuts with a circular saw. It's an awkward position to cut in. You want to be sure that the ladder is stable and that you're in complete control of the saw at all times. We mark the end of this joist by temporarily nailing it in place and measuring out the correct distance from the outside of the beam to the inside of the joist. This first one gets some extra support. Besides nailing it into the beam, we used a joist hanger at one end and lag screws to reinforce the nails.
Now we move on to the joists that fit into the upside-down hangers. We put in one internal joist to have something to nail the rim joist into. You can see how the inverted joist hanger will eliminate the diving board effect when there's weight out on the cantilever.
Yep.
This final rim joist gets set in place at the proper angle, 45 degrees.
There. Okay, over this way a little bit.
This shows us where to cut the ends. We take it down, cut it, and nail it in place. Now all that's left is to put in the rest of the joist for the cantilevered section. Perfect.
Look good?
Mm-hmm.
Since the rim joists are already in place, we're able to measure each of these joists individually and cut them to length. We also bevel the ends where necessary.
The surface, rails, and stairs of a deck are places to consider using different types of wood. Popular choices include cedar, cypress, and redwood. These woods have natural oils in them, which makes them resistant to decay. We'll be using redwood 2x6s for our deck, our railing, and our stairs. And we'll be running them at an angle to the house for an interesting visual effect. We start with the short board and set it flush along the angled side. We let it overhang a little at each end. That's okay. We attach it with 16-penny casing nails and hammer very carefully. This is dry construction heart redwood. It's beautiful, but it's soft. Any hammer dents will be eyesores for years. We'll go back later and set the nails just below the surface with a nail set. The second board gets spaced away from the first with a 16-penny nail.
The next board will extend well beyond the boards that are already down. To have a guide in nailing it, we mark the outside edge with a scrap 2x6 and extend the line with the chalk line.
Over that way, and perfect.
Okay. This span is too long for one board, so we see where the board will end and take the angle to the joist with the bevel square. The bevel square allows us to transfer the angle down to the ground where we saw the end. Since a circular saw leaves a cleaner edge on the underside, we turn the bottom of the board up when we saw. Now we bring the board up, nail it in place on the chalk mark, and follow the same process to cut the board that meets it.
Okay, back just a little bit. All right, got it?
Right there.
All right. Putting down decking is a very satisfying part of the project. You really get to see the structure change from a wooden frame into a real deck. ended up with a bit of a problem here. Our boards weren't parallel as we approached this side, so we adjusted the spacing a little bit on the last few boards, making the gap a little larger towards the end of the deck.
With the decking installed, we snap chalk lines along the perimeter and remove the excess with a circular saw. Okay, right there. The saw blade is set to cut just through the decking. This keeps me from cutting into the joist. On the first side, I cut just up to the corner. On the second side, I do what's called a plunge cut to get the saw started. Then JoAnne finishes the corner with a handsaw. With all the structural elements complete, we'll add a fascia board around the edge of the deck surface. Now this is a 2x10 that will nail into the rim joists even with the top of the deck boards. This gives a nice clean edge to the deck. In particular, it covers up the ends of the deck boards.
Here at this corner, we have to cut the ends of the fascia on an angle so they'll meet flush. Because this is a 45-degree corner, we cut a 22.5-degree bevel on each piece.
On the far end, we use a beveled piece of scrap to find out where the outside corner will fall. Then we measure for what will be the longer side of the board from point to point. Okay, you have it there?
Yep.
All right, 98 exactly. We use a combination square to mark the cut line. Then I set the circular saw to cut a 22.5-degree cut. Before I make the cut, I line the blade up to the mark and clamp a scrap piece of wood along the side of the saw to guide me when I cut. Now, I just push the saw along the guide.
For the railing on this deck, we're using 4x4 posts at every corner and 2x2 balusters in between. The balusters are 7 inches on center, so that leaves us a gap of 5.5 inches. And that's a ½ inch smaller than the maximum gap allowed by most codes. A good test for this is to see if there's any place in the railing where this 6-inch ball can squeeze through. This looks pretty good. The 4x4 corner pieces get lag screwed into place. We drilled holes into the post for the screws, and we start them into the fascia with a hammer. Notice that the bottom is beveled.
The spacing on this side is actually a little less than 5.5 inches. We did this to avoid having one gap at the end a little smaller than the rest. To get even spacing between the 2x2s, we'll have to make small adjustments like this for almost every span of railing.
Taking into account that the verticals run from the bottom of the fascia board to the bottom of the handrail, we used a power miter to cut them to 44 inches. We also added a bevel to the bottom of each one. Then we nailed them into the fascia boards. Finally, we put on the cap rail, nailing into the ends of the verticals and mitering the corners. Good. So far in our deck construction, we've been doing fundamental carpentry that doesn't require a professional to accomplish. Our next task, however, is to build a staircase from the ground level to the deck. A folded stairway differs in design from a standard straight stairway in that it makes a bend at a landing. This involves a good deal more planning and careful calculation. Before we show you what that entails, let's go back to the studio to show you the steps and components of a basic stairway.
We're building a staircase to the 6-foot platform to demonstrate the basics for stair construction for decks. Many of the same principles apply to interior stairs. This is a stringer, the piece of wood that supports the steps or treads. The height of each step, the rise, and the depth of each step, the run, are determined by standard formulas that reflect the stride of an average person.
Before we cut the stringer to create the notches that the treads will sit on, we had to determine the number of steps for the flight. This is where we started working on our rise and our run formulas. Since 7.5 inches is the ideal height or rise for a step, you divide the total rise of the staircase from floor to floor by 7.5. Our platform surface is 6 feet off the ground, or 72 inches. Dividing by 7.5 inches, we got 9.6 stairs. We couldn't leave a fractional step in the staircase. That would trip people up. So we rounded off to the nearest whole number, which is 10. Now we go back and calculate the actual rise for 10 steps. This turns out to be 7.2 inches, about 7 3/16. There are a couple of formulas for determining the run once you've got the rise. The simplest is that the rise multiplied by the run should be somewhere between 72 and 75 inches. If we divide 72 inches by our rise of 7.2 inches, we get a nice even run of 10 inches. There's also a little bit of flexibility with these formulas, which is helpful if you need to get a stair to fit a particular space. Also, you can check the project guide for more rise and run formulas.
We make our stringers out of 10-foot 2x12s. There's a trick for marking the stringer. I clamp a scrap of wood to a framing square on the marks for the rise and the run dimensions. Then I can just butt the wood up to the side of the 2x12 and mark on the outside edges of the square. The first mark I make is for the second step from the top, since the deck itself is actually the 10th step. I slide the square up to the end until I've got one complete 10-inch run and mark it. Then we mark a right angle from the end of that line to the bottom of the board. The second mark creates the edge of the stringer that will lean against the deck at the top of the stairs. Now I can go down the top of the stringer and mark the notches for the remaining steps. I use a circular saw, cutting just up to the mark from both sides. Then JoAnne uses a handsaw to complete the cut. The first stringer you cut will serve as a template to mark the others. We flip the cut stringer over so that the mark side is down.
There are several methods for securing the top of the stringer into the frame of the deck. A lot depends on what sort of a structure you're going to be mounting into at the top. There are diagrams in the project guide that'll show you a couple ways on how to do this. We're using joist hangers. We've added a cross piece to have a solid surface to mount the hanger on, and we made a notch in the stringer for the hanger.
We've also added a cross piece to secure the ends at the bottom. Notice that the last step at the bottom here seems like it's going to be shorter than the rest, but it really isn't. I cut it shorter by the thickness of the 2x6 tread. This way, when we nail the treads on, it will be the full 7 3/16 inches tall. Calculating the cuts for a stringer can be pretty complicated, so unless you've done it before, it's a good idea to make yourself a scale diagram, including the treads and the top of the deck, to make sure you get it right.
The treads are 2x6s that we're spacing for drainage and nailing to the stringers. Two 2x6s spaced 1/4 inch apart end up being 11 1/4 inches wide. This leaves a 1-inch overhang past the stringer.
With the treads installed, it's time for a railing. We start with a 2x2 baluster near the bottom. We beveled the end to match the angle of the bottom of the stringer. Then a second baluster goes on the top step. Most codes specify a railing that rises to between 30 and 34 inches above the front of the tread. By marking 30 inches off on a level, we can be sure that we reach the minimum height with the 2x6 we're using for a handrail. Then we clamp it in place and repeat the procedure at the top. Now we can mark the end of the rail and cut it to length. Then the rest of the balusters go in. On each step, we're putting one in the middle and one on the front edge of the stringer.
Now we secure the balusters to the handrail. We plumb them before we nail them in. The top of the rail will vary depending on how you want to tie it in with your deck railing. There are also several ways to secure the bottom of the stairs. For instance, if you're pouring a concrete slab, you might want to embed some fasteners to tie in with the wood at the bottom.
This is a pretty simple staircase. It runs straight, there are no landings, and there's no overhangs to get in the way of the railing supports.
For a look at a more complicated stair project, let's examine what goes into building our folding stairs for the exterior deck. Our first step in building a stairway is to figure out where the landing is going to be.
What have you got?
103 1/4.
Okay. To locate the landing, using our rise and run formulas, we approximated we would need about 14 steps. Now we can locate the landing anywhere, but for aesthetic reasons, we decided to locate it midway between the top of the deck and the ground. To calculate its location, we started by measuring from the top of the deck to the ground and dividing by the number of stairs, or 14, to give us a rise of 7 3/8 inches. We multiply this times the number of steps from the top of the deck to the landing, or 7 steps, to give us 51 5/8 inches. We take this measurement, measure from the top of the deck down to the top of the landing. Now we proceed as if building a miniature deck. We start with the posts, put in a beam,
Okay, you want to come down here? Down? That's good. Okay.
then place the joists, starting with the rim joist.
Okay, go ahead. Great. Over. We put in a couple of deck boards. And follow with fascia. Now we build 2 flights of stairs, one leading from the deck down to the landing and another from the landing to the ground.
We already know the rise for each step. We get a run of 12 inches. At the top, the stringers are mounted to a support piece with joist hangers. At the bottom, we notch them to fit around the landing and rest on it.
The treads go down on top of the stringers, flush to the outside. We need 2 2x6s and 1 2x2 for the 12-inch run. And we pre-drill the ends in the soft redwood. The railing consists of 4x4 posts and a 2x6 nailed to the side. It rises 30 inches above the front of the tread. We fill in with 2x2 balusters, beveled at each end. With this, our deck is essentially finished.
Deck construction is mostly good carpentry, common sense, and careful planning. A deck this size would take us at least 2 weeks to complete ourselves. As with other projects, there are variables particular to the requirements of your deck or deck site.
Of course, we couldn't cover every situation that might arise. Check the bibliography in the project guide for any reference material on deck design and construction.
And be sure to check out our other Hometime titles. I'm Dean Johnson.
And I'm JoAnne Liebeler. Thanks for joining us.
Hometime is made possible by Chevy Truck, who brings you tough, full-size Chevy pickups for professionals and do-it-yourselfers like you. Chevy S10 pickups, compact, fun, and hard-working. Chevy S10 Blazer, logic and laughter in 2 or 4-wheel drive. Chevy Astro, the van that can. The heartbeat of America. Today's Chevy Truck.